Hey there, we are back. We are going to continue with digestive system. We're going to start looking at functional anatomy of certain parts. And we're going to start at the most proximal end, the mouth, and work our way down. So let's go over to those lecture notes that I just had up and get started. So we're starting there at the mouth, and we're not going to spend a lot of time on these areas. We're going to spend more time in the stomach, the small intestine, where a lot of the action is occurring. But there's a few things we want to say here about the mouth. So we have the tongue, which is an accessory organ going into the mouth. There are serous and mucus glands that are in and around the tongue. The tongue helps mix the food with the saliva produced during chewing to form a bolus of food. All right, so you probably don't really notice how active your tongue is when you're eating because it just happens. But next time you eat, you can kind of notice what your tongue is doing to move the food around and to form a bolus or a little like ball of food in the very back. It also initiates swallowing, so it helps form a bolus, and it also initiates swallowing, right? Both mechanically by pushing the food to the back of the mouth and starting the swallowing, but also neurally as well. There are papillae, and you might remember these when we did taste, the finger-like projections on the tongue. The filiform ones don't have taste buds, the others do, right? So that's just a reminder. And you have your frenulum, which is the little line that secures the tongue to the floor of the mouth. It's underneath your tongue. And then we have our salivary glands, and this is where we're going to spend the most time up here in the mouth. We have intrinsic and extrinsic. Okay, so most saliva comes from accessory glands that are extrinsic. Okay, so that are outside the mouth. Remember, extrinsic means outside the mouth. So we're going to look at these, okay? On this part right here. Oops, I see there's a typo. We'll fix that. This somehow got all messed up right there, and we'll just fix it. So what is this supposed to be? This right here is supposed to be, let's see, where can I type it? Buccal glands. Okay. And we'll go through all of these in just a moment. So before we get there, the major function of saliva. So the salivary glands are secreting most of the saliva, accessory salivary glands, the ones outside. And we'll get to those in a second. And so what do? Well, we know that it dissolves food chemicals for taste sensation. Remember, taste, we had to dissolve chemicals in water. So the saliva is the water. It helps clean the teeth by washing over the teeth and making, cleaning debris and also washing away some bacteria. It moistens food and aids in the formation of a bolus, and that's really important. We can't eat super, super dry foods and try to swallow them because they're too dry to swallow. There's a thing called like the saltine cracker challenge where you try to eat so many of saltine or Ritz crackers and 30 seconds and swallow it, and you can't get above a certain number because they're so dry you can't make enough saliva to swallow them. I don't recommend you try it, but it is a thing. And then the last thing, actually there's two more things. We'll add one more. There's enzymes that start to break down starches and carbohydrates. You probably have heard of salivary amylase before. But very limited effects on lipids and even less on proteins. And so for the purposes of this class, we're going to ignore any lipid or protein breakdown that occurs here. We're going to focus on where protein and lipid breakdown occur elsewhere. All right. But there is a 5. We'll put a 5 in here as well. I guess I'll have to put it right there, 5. And this 5 is bactericidal effects. Bactericidal effects. And these are things like lysozymes, enzymes that will destroy the bacteria and other things that make the mouth inhabitable to certain bacteria. Some bacteria can live in your mouth, of course, but others this will help. So saliva is very important. Now, there are 3 extrinsic glands and 1 intrinsic gland, and I'll underline these differently. They're the intrinsic glands, the buccals, all right? And then we have the parotids, the submandibular, or also sometimes called submaxillary, and sublinguals. Okay? So the buccal glands are those small glands are located inside the mouth on the sides. If you open up your cheek and you kind of look in there, you'll see these a little hole like in the center on each side of your cheek, and those are those glands. And they secrete a watery serous liquid and some mucus in a 50-50 ratio. And so they're secreting small amounts of saliva all the time. But the majority of saliva are from these three: the parotid, the submandibular, and the sublingual. Now, the parotid secretes mostly serous liquid and that has salivary amylase, the thing that breaks down the carbohydrates. And so I'm going to actually write over here. This is where chemical digestion of carbohydrates begins. Right here, right at this very first spot, due to the salivary amylase. These parotid glands are in front of the ear and under the masseter muscle of your jaw. And sometimes if you eat a really sour thing, you'll get almost a little pain there because they're reacting to the sour in your mouth. They're secreting very quickly and kind of contracting, and you kind of feel them. Those are the parotid glands. The submandibular or submaxillary glands are exactly where it sounds like they would be. They're below the base of the tongue near the mandible. And they secrete a mixture of the amylase and the mucus in a 50-50 ratio. And then the sublingual glands, they secrete mostly mucus. So isn't that interesting? We have one that does mostly serous liquid, one that's 50-50, and one that's mostly mucus. So the nice thing is if you need more mucus or you need more salivary amylase, you can kind of do what you need. These, since they're under the tongue because of their sublingual, and their ducts are underneath the tongue as well. So obviously the serous cells that are in these glands produce the salivary amylase, and the mucus cells produce a viscous solution containing mucin. Now mucin is a glycoprotein that when we dissolve it in water, it becomes what we call mucus. Right? So that's where that name comes from. Now, under normal conditions, as we said, saliva is constantly going into your mouth, and you get about 1 liter to 1.5 liters a day of saliva produced. There are lots of things that will stimulate it. If you have abrasion, if you have food in your mouth, that'll start to have saliva secretion. You can even have sight or smell or memories that will make your mouth water, right? If you just smell some delicious thing, all of a sudden your mouth might start watering in expectation of it. This is primarily controlled by the parasympathetic nervous system. And we kind of talked a little bit about this before. And there's salivatory nuclei in the brainstem. So parasympathetic. And the facial nerve, the glossopharyngeal, and the vagus nerve are all involved. These all will produce saliva. And remember, it's parasympathetic. Sympathetic division will override and reduce and lower salivation or saliva production. Okay. Now, the next thing we're going to talk about is we're going to talk about teeth. And I'm going to spend very, unfortunately, little time on teeth. People who are dental hygienist going to dental hygienist programs, you're going to get a lot more information there, and so we just don't need to really cover it very much. The teeth mainly are made of crowns and roots. The roots are below the surface and attached to the periodontal ligaments that we talked about in previous class, and the crown is exposed above the surface. There are incisors, canines, molars, and premolars, and basically you start out with one set of teeth that's about 20 teeth. 20 teeth that we usually have gone by about 12 years of age. And then our permanent teeth are 32 teeth, and they're in by about the 12 years of age, other than our wisdom teeth, which come in a little later. And that's all I want to say about them. I guess the other thing to think about, though, is that these different types of teeth have different actions. So the molars in the back here are more for grinding and breaking down plant fibers and things like that, where the incisors are more for snapping things off. Like if you were to eat a carrot stick and put a carrot stick there, you'd break it. And then the canines are sharper and are more sharp in certain animals and are for ripping and tearing flesh. So those are the purposes of our different teeth, but we're really not going to say anything else about them right now. But we will spend a little time on the pharynx. So the pharynx is the second organ involved in swallowing. Okay, swallowing. There are two portions involved in the swallowing process, the oropharynx and the laryngopharynx. Now the oropharynx, remember, is right behind the mouth here. So if I just type in oro here, you will see that the oropharynx is this opening right behind the mouth. And then we have the laryngopharynx, which is the one above it, actually. I don't know if I can get here. Let's see if I can. There we go. That'll work. Laryngopharynx. All right, which is right back here. Okay. Laryngopharynx. All right. So both of these passageways have multiple things that can be in them. We can obviously have air in. We can breathe through our mouths. And we breathe through our nose, and then it goes down into our laryngopharynx. We can put food in our mouth and swallow it. We can put fluids in our mouth and swallow it. So these areas are multiple passageways for multiple things. Now, what is the epithelium type? It is stratified squamous epithelium. It's non-keratinized. It doesn't need to be waterproof. So, it needs to be abrasion proof, right? It has to withstand layers coming off due to foods that we eat that might be too rough, or things that go into our mouth. Like if we burn some part of our mouth, we want to be able to have other layers that are healthy below. The lamina propria underneath it is going to have that areolar connective tissue we talked about already, and lots of vascular structures. The muscularis mucosa is going to be skeletal muscle here. We mentioned this last time, okay? And it allows for voluntary propulsion. So our pharynx we have control over, okay, in both of those two areas. Then we get to the esophagus. Once we start to swallow the food, we're going to have it enter the esophagus. It's a distendable, collapsible tube. So normally the esophagus is closed. And when food goes in it, then it opens to the size of the food, all right? It lies behind the trachea and extends all the way down to the stomach. It has to then pierce the diaphragm at the esophageal hiatus, which is the name of the area where it goes through the diaphragm. And it attaches the stomach at the level of the cardiac orifice, which, as it's implied, is near the heart. Okay. Now, when it's empty, the mucosa and the submucosa will form a lot of longitudinal folds, which is the rugae, which I talked about last lecture. These folds that form when there's nothing there. As food goes in, then it stretches out and increases its surface area. The upper esophageal sphincter, and I believe there's a picture in your book that shows both of these. Yeah, so on page 884, I'm going to go over and bring the book up. One moment, I'm going to pause. All right, I'm back. And so right up here at the top of the esophagus, this is on page 884, there is a upper esophageal sphincter, or UES. And down here is a lower esophageal sphincter, LES, or gastroesophageal sphincter, because it's at the border between the stomach and the esophagus. And so those are the two that I'm referring to, all right? And what we want to have happen is we need to have those relax and allow food into them, and then open and allow food to go out. So the upper esophageal sphincter, the UES, is right around the where the cricocartilage is, and when it's relaxed, it allows food to enter into the esophagus from the pharynx. And then peristalsis will occur, and that food will get pushed down via peristalsis down to the lower esophageal sphincter. We'll change colors here just to have contrast. Okay, and the lower esophageal sphincter is right at the diaphragm, and when it is relaxed, it allows food to enter the stomach from the esophagus. Now, interestingly, this sphincter isn't a true sphincter. It's just a thickening of the circular smooth muscle of the diaphragm. Unfortunately, that becomes problematic because sometimes we can get acids from the stomach going back up into the esophagus because this doesn't stay completely tight. Now, the diaphragm does help keep it closed, which is good. And so if your diaphragm is healthy and working well, that helps. So anyway, that's kind of an interesting thing, that it's not a true sphincter. And sometimes we get GERD, we get esophageal reflux because of it. The wall, as all of these are going to have a mucosa, submucosa, muscularis eterna, and adventitia. Remember, this has adventitia, not serosa. Now, the mucosa, what do we need to say about it? We're only going to highlight things that are like interesting or unique about them. And so this mucosa has that same stratified squamous epithelium that we saw in the mouth and the pharynx. The lamina propria still has areolar connective tissue, still has vascular structures, still has some leukocytes, and it has esophageal glands that secrete mucus. And I believe you see those in lab this week. The muscularis mucosa is, again, 2 layers of smooth muscle. Now, the upper part of it is more skeletal muscle, the very top, and the lower part is smooth. So once we get past just the very beginning of the esophagus, we can't control the muscle anymore. So most of it is smooth muscle. Okay. Now, the submucosal layer is going to have a lot of blood vessels like it normally does, lymphatics like it normally does. It has some leukocytes to protect us, and it has some submucosal glands as well. And these aren't, we don't need to worry much about them, but they are there. They're kind of like minor salivary glands. Now, in the esophagus, you will see that there is muscularis externa. Oh, I misspoke earlier. This muscularis mucosa is always smooth muscle, right? The muscularis mucosa is just throwing it into folds. The part that changes is the external muscle. So apologize for that error there. The proximal third of the skeletal muscle, or the proximal third of the esophagus, is skeletal muscle, and you have a little control over that. If you start to swallow something, you might be able to kind of cough it, get it back up again, or you might control it a little. But once we get down to the middle and the distal third, it is all really starting to be smooth muscle, a little bit in the top part. But after that, you have no conscious control over anything that's in your esophagus. The food moves via peristalsis, as we mentioned a minute ago. And actually, this feature explains why skeletal muscle disorders can cause esophageal swallowing digestive dysfunction, because the upper third-ish is skeletal muscle. So people who have skeletal muscle disorders can have swallowing problems. Now, remember, there's adventitia here instead of serosa. This layer attaches to surrounding structures, all right? And that's why we call it adventitia. I'm not worried about the luminal narrowing, but there is some there. The functions of the esophagus are basically to conduct food and fluids from the pharynx to the stomach, and, as we said a minute ago, to prevent reflux of gastric contents back into the esophagus. And this is where we want that sphincteric tone. If we have a loose lower esophageal sphincter, we can unfortunately sometimes get acid reflux back up into the esophagus. So exercise, losing weight, things like that will help our sphincteric tone get better. So that's really important. Okay. Now, what about the digestive processes occurring in the mouth, the pharynx, and the esophagus? All right, well, the first we know is mastication, chewing. We've already talked about that. We know that's mechanical digestion, and all macromolecules get this here. So one thing to think about is mechanical digestion. Every single macromolecule starts at the mouth, whether it's a fat, a protein, or a carbohydrate. All of them start here. Okay? When we digest or when we chew, we're increasing surface area, which mixes the saliva to form a bolus. All right? And that allows the salivary amylase. I'll do this in a different color just for contrast. The salivary amylase can now mix, and we get the starting of chemical digestion of starches, like we mentioned earlier. So all mechanical digestion occurs in the mouth. Chemical digestion of starches occurs in the mouth as well. The other chemical digestion of significance of fats and proteins occur later in the digestive system. We'll get to that later. As we said, deglutition or swallowing is very complicated, about 20 muscle groups, and there's two phases, a voluntary and involuntary phase. So let's look at those. The buccal phase, voluntary, that's where the boluses move to the oropharynx. Then we have the pharyngeal and esophageal phase, and this is involuntary. And this is where the bolus that's in the oropharynx stimulates impulses that are located in our medulla and lower pons, right, in our brainstem. And then this causes cranial nerves 9 and 10 to actually cause a very complicated movement of the soft palate and uvula, close off the nasopharynx, and make sure that the epiglottis seals off the trachea, and we get swallowing to occur. So we don't need to go into all the details of how that happens, but it's complicated and has a voluntary and an involuntary phase. Okay, next let's move to the stomach. Now the stomach is got capacity that can really change as we stretch the smooth muscle of the stomach. So normally the stomach is around 1,200 to 1,500 mils worth of stuff in it, but it can go up to 4,000, about tripling. If you have a very big meal, it's going to distend and accept that large meal. It's a little left of our midline beneath the diaphragm, right? And it is the site of mechanical breakdown for all foods, not the original site. Remember, original mechanical breakdown is chewing in the mouth, but it is site of mechanical breakdown for all foods, and this is via that churning, right? Churning. And this is where chemical breakdown of protein begins, okay, or starts. Okay, so chemical breakdown of protein starts here. As we said before, there might be a small amount in the mouth, but for this class, we're not going to assume that there's any significant protein breakdown in the mouth. The majority of the protein breakdown is going to occur and start here in the stomach. So that's what I want you to think about. Now, as we start to break down and churn this food, it becomes kind of liquidy and kind of like a thick gruel, and we call the stuff that's digested leaving the stomach chyme. Okay, that's a ch word. That's a ka, like chimera, chyme. All right. Now the gross anatomy of the stomach is it's divided into 4 areas. All right, and we'll go ahead and put numbers in here for them. We have the cardia, or cardiac region, the fundus, the body, and the pylorus. Okay, and we can put those same ones up here. So we have number 1, we've got number 2, we've got number 3, and we've got number 4. And number 4, I'm going to draw a little thing, a little more number 4 is really from about here to about there. That's number 4. Okay. Now, what's in each of these regions? The cardiac region, which is that is near the heart, is where food enters from the esophagus. Okay, so this is where food enters the esophagus and where the LES is. The fundus is the rounded superior portion of the stomach. The body is the large central portion. And then we have the pylorus. And the pylorus has 2 parts, the antrum and the pyloric canal. Now the antrum is right over here. This is where it narrows from the body, and it starts narrowing here. And then we have the pyloric canal. And the pyloric canal I'm going to move it up, don't worry. If I can, come on, move up. Pyloric canal is right there. And this is what communicates with the duodenum or duodenum, which is this guy right here, right there. Right there. All right. And right here, notice how this tissue narrows right there. That is the sphincter. And this is the pyloric sphincter or pyloric valve. And that is a true sphincter right there. And that will stay nice and tight and closed. A couple other quick things that are down at the bottom of the page, but we can put up here is, it actually jumped to the next page. There's 3 layers of smooth muscle in the stomach, so we'll just go ahead and put that. And there's the longitudinal, circular, and oblique layers, and I'm not going to label them, but you can see there's different layers running in different directions here, and those are the 3 different layers. And then you can see the rugae, the folding in the stomach that's on the mucosal layer there. So that's good to see as well. Now for the histology or microscopic anatomy, you may have already looked at the microscopic stomach, and one thing you saw is that there are these deep pits and glands that go down far away from the surface, all right? And so these have the same layers that we've seen in the digestive tract, but there's some definite modifications because there's some really important things happening here in the stomach. So at the mucosal layer, the big one is that the epithelium changes from stratified squamous to simple columnar, okay? So let's actually just say that. The epithelium is simple columnar, okay? And it's got a lot of goblet cells. And you should know that goblet cells produce mucus, right? They produce mucus. We've seen this in numerous places in previous slides. So we have a lot of mucus being produced. Why are we producing so much mucus? Well, the mucus that we're producing protects the stomach. And these are modifications to assist with protecting the stomach from the low pH. Now, we haven't really talked about the pH yet, but the hydrochloric acid that the stomach produces to help break down and denature proteins is very low. The pH tends to be around 1 to 2, right? That would destroy most of our cells in our body. If I had pH 1 or 2 hydrochloric acid, I put it on your skin, it would burn you. So why does the cells of the stomach survive? Well, these are the 4 reasons right here. These are the modifications that we see in the stomach, all right, that will allow the stomach not to become destroyed. So the first is what we were just talking about. Let me put these in a different color here. The first is a thick mucus barrier. The more mucus, the more protection the cells below will have. The second thing is get tight junctions. We do not want any leakage of this hydrochloric acid into cells in farther, deeper layers of the stomach. The third is deep in the gastric pits, which are these things right here. The pits are right there. And actually, I can type that in right now if you want. We'll put gastric pit right there. And then down here, these are the gastric glands. Okay. And in the gastric pit area, there's plasma membrane of the glandular cells that resist hydrochloric acid. Now, the last one, or this one in the middle here that I skipped, is that these cells, all the cells that are lining the stomach, have rapid turnover, which means they die within 3 to 6 days, but we make new ones. So the stomach is entirely making its mucous membrane new every 3 to 6 days. All of these things allow the stomach to have a low pH environment, and the cells can still survive. Okay. Now the pits that are there open down into these gastric glands. You can see those below, and we'll talk more about those gastric glands probably next time. I don't know if we're going to get to it today. Well, let's see. Sure, I guess we can. We can get to it today, right now. Yeah, let's do it. All right. So the pits there on the top, they are lined with the simple columnar epithelium. We've already said that. And here, I'm going to change back to a different color. It's a little more attractive. Let's go yellow. And these and then these go down to the gastric glands. Okay, so you can see the pits are on top, and then the glands go down very deep. Now, in those glands, there are different cell types, and your book has a nice picture on page 886. I'm going to pull that up right now. Give me one moment. Okay, here we are. I actually clicked on this picture, so I've kind of taken it out. And you can see that there are different cell types that are here. And we really want to look at the different cells. And so on your notes, let's see here. How do we want to do this? On your notes, you're going to notice that there are mucosal neck cells. There are parietal or oxonic cells. There are chief cells. And then there are enteroendocrine cells, G cells. So we have 4 different secretory cells. 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, so now let's look for all of those on that picture in just a minute. So the neck cells, they secrete different types of mucus. Remember, we want to have a lot of mucus here. That was one of our protective things. These are up near the neck region of the gastric gland, all right? And they're primarily for protection. So if there's irritation in that area, whether that be acid or food, we get more mucus secreted. It's very protective. It's like a positive feedback loop. Then we have the parietal cells. They produce the hydrochloric acid. The hydrochloric acid has 2 functions. One is things that are in an acidic environment will denature. So the hydrochloric acid will denature things. It also activates stomach digestive enzymes. Most enzymes like to be at much higher pHs, closer to neutral. Stomach pH is so low that the enzymes there work best in that low acid environment or high acid environment, low pH environment. So it does really 3 things. One, or we can call them A. Why don't we do it this way? We'll say A, B, and C, and then D as well. All right. So actually, let's do it this way. A, B, and C is what the hydrochloric acid does. These are the functions of hydrochloric acid. Functions of HCl. Okay, so 1, it activates the stomach digestive enzymes. 2, it maintains an extremely acidic environment, around 1 to 3. And as I said before, that will also help by denaturing food proteins. Okay. The third thing is it's bacteriocytic, acidic, which means that it's low pH. Bacteria don't want to live there. It will destroy bacteria. Okay. Now, The parietal, I'll use a different color here. The parietal cells also secrete, in addition to hydrochloric acid, intrinsic factor. And what intrinsic factor does is it's a glycoprotein, and it helps absorb vitamin B12. And we talked about that, I think, before in another class. And that's essential for DNA synthesis. So we like, we need vitamin B12, and intrinsic factor helps us get it. Okay? The third cell type are the chief or zymogenic cells. These guys have a specific pathway where they secrete pepsinogen, which is a precursor to pepsin. Okay? We'll use a different color. We seem to be doing different colors here. So these chief cells secrete pepsinogen, which is the precursor to pepsin, which is one of the main digestive enzymes. And hydrochloric acid is what catalyzes the conversion of pepsinogen to pepsin. So we said up here that hydrochloric acid needed to activate the stomach's enzymes. Here it is happening right here. Hydrochloric acid will take the inactive pepsinogen and turn it into active pepsin. The fourth one are the enteroendocrine cells, or G cells. And they're called G cells because they secrete a hormone, specifically gastrin. Let's do a different color. So we've been doing different colors here. So the G cells, or enteroendocrine cells, secrete gastrin. And gastrin we're going to talk about more. It's essential for stomach digestion, both mechanically and chemically. It makes the stomach mechanically more active and chemically more active. We will talk about that later, not in this lecture, but in our next lecture. Okay. Actually, I think that's a great place to stop. Let's stop there because the digestive processes in the stomach are complicated, and we're going to spend a few pages on it. And so I think what we'll do is we'll stop right there. That'll be a great place. And then we can come back and look at the stomach in more detail and then move down into the small intestine also later. Okay? Great. All right. Thanks, guys. See you later.